Welcome, dear literature enthusiasts, to this gathering of minds where we treat movies not simply as entertainment, but as layered texts. Stories that beg to be read, analyzed, and lived with, the way one pores over a novel late into the night, underlining passages and scribbling thoughts in the margins. Before we step into today's exploration, let me gently remind you, if you find joy in these conversations, if the act of peeling back layers of art to discover what lies beneath excites you as much as it excites me, please do consider liking this video and subscribing. Not as a transaction, but as a way of saying, yes, I too believe in storytelling as a mirror, a lamp, a bridge. And let me also be clear from the very beginning, this is not a conventional review. There are no star ratings here, no verdicts of good or bad. What I'm sharing is an intellectual meditation, a piece of critical reflection meant for those who, like me, love to approach film the way one approaches literature, with patience, curiosity, and reverence for its deeper resonances. Now, about the film in question, Karate Kid, Legends 2025. I can almost hear the weight of its title hanging in the air, carrying with it not only cinematic nostalgia, but also a promise. That sense of continuity that stretches across decades, reminding us that certain stories are less like cultural artifacts and more like living myths, retold and reimagined for each generation. The very act of sitting down to watch it felt less like consuming entertainment and more like opening a chapter in a story I've been reading since childhood. Perhaps you know the feeling, that shiver of recognition when a beloved narrative returns, altered by time, yet familiar enough to stir something deep in you. For me, it was impossible not to think back to my own awkward teenage years, when martial arts films were less about fighting and more about longing, for discipline, for purpose, for a mentor who could make sense of the chaos of adolescence. Watching this new chapter unfold, I found myself not just evaluating its craft, but reliving my own memories. Afternoons spent in a dim neighborhood dojo, the smell of mats worn thin by years of practice, the strange mix of sweat and silence, discipline and rebellion. And suddenly, as the first scenes flickered across the screen, I was no longer just a spectator, but a participant in the mythos, carrying my own history into the shadows and lights of the story. What immediately strikes you about this film is the way it frames legacy, not as a static inheritance, but as something fragile, uncertain, perpetually reshaped. From its opening frames, you sense a tension between past and present, between traditions that risk becoming brittle and the restless energy of youth that demands transformation. The characters move through this tension with a kind of grace that feels almost literary. Each gesture, each line of dialogue echoing themes of memory, resilience, and the eternal struggle to find balance between who we were told to be and who we must become. If I were to sketch the arc of the story in broad strokes, without spoiling too much, because part of the joy lies in the unfolding, it begins with dislocation. A young protagonist stands at the crossroads of cultures, bearing the weight of expectations they never chose. Their journey is framed not merely as the pursuit of skill or victory, but as the pursuit of self, an exploration of identity that feels painfully relevant in a world where so many of us are constantly negotiating between inherited legacies and our own restless impulses. There are moments of breathtaking intimacy, quiet training sequences where silence speaks louder than dialogue, where the rhythm of breath and movement becomes poetry. And then there are the moments of spectacle, the clashes that leave you holding your breath, not merely because of the choreography, but because you sense what is truly at stake. These fights, if we can even call them that, are never simply about winning or losing. They are texts in motion, arguments played out through fists and stances, carrying within them questions of loyalty, freedom, pride, and redemption. One of the things I most admired, and this might sound unusual, is the way the film resists the temptation to wallow in nostalgia. It honors its roots, certainly. There are nods, echoes, even direct visual rhymes that will delight those who have followed the story from the beginning. But it never allows itself to become a museum piece. Instead, it pushes forward, forcing characters and audience alike to confront uncomfortable truths. That mentors are not infallible, that traditions can both ground us and limit us, and that even the most sacred legacies must be interrogated if they are to remain alive. Of course, woven through all this intellectual richness is a plot that carries its own thrill. Without giving away every turn, I can say that the narrative builds around a delicate dance of rivalry and reconciliation. Old alliances resurface in unexpected ways. Hidden histories come to light, reshaping the way we view certain figures who seemed, at first, one-dimensional. There are betrayals that cut deeply, not because they are shocking, but because they feel inevitable, the culmination of years of unresolved tensions. And then, just when you think the arc is clear, a twist emerges that reframes the entire story, forcing you to reconsider what loyalty, honor, and mentorship truly mean. One of my favorite aspects, though perhaps favorite isn't the right word, since it left me unsettled for days, is how the film refuses to give us easy resolutions. There are victories, yes, but they are complicated, bittersweet, shadowed by loss and ambiguity. Characters achieve growth, but not without scars. In this way, the film mirrors life more than fairy tale. It tells us that becoming who we are meant to be often requires sacrifice, and that reconciliation with our past does not always mean closure. What lingers, long after the credits, is not just the choreography or the plot twists, but the texture of the journey. The weight of silence between mentor and student, the vulnerability of a young person trying to forge an identity, the aching beauty of traditions carried forward and reshaped by new hands. To me, that's what makes this more than a film. It's a meditation on inheritance and transformation, on how we carry the past while still daring to step into the future. And perhaps that is why it resonated so strongly with me personally. Watching it, I was reminded of my own teachers, the ones who guided me, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, toward a better version of myself. I thought of the times I resisted them, the times I misunderstood them, and the ways those tensions ultimately shaped me. I thought, too, of the legacies I've inherited from family and culture, and how difficult it can be to honor them without being consumed by them. The film, in its own way, felt like a mirror to those struggles, a reminder that growth is rarely linear, and that mentorship, like art, is an ongoing dialogue rather than a finished lesson. In teasing what lies ahead in the story, let me simply say, it is not a film of simple arcs. It is layered with reversals, with revelations that upend our assumptions. Just when you believe you've mapped its moral geography, a character makes a choice that throws the entire terrain into new relief. And yet, it never feels manipulative. Every twist feels earned, grounded in the psychology of the characters and the themes that pulse beneath the surface. As the story barrels toward its climax, the stakes rise not only in physical terms, but in existential ones. What's truly being fought over is not a trophy or a title, but the right to define one's own life, the right to carry forward a tradition without being crushed beneath it. The final sequences are exhilarating not only for their choreography, but for their emotional gravity. You feel the weight of history in every strike, every block, every moment of hesitation. And when it ends, when the dust settles and the echoes fade, you are left not with the sense of having consumed a neat story, but with the sensation of having wrestled with something larger than yourself. Like closing a profound novel, you carry it with you, turning it over in your mind, seeing your own life reflected in its pages. That, I think, is the true gift of cinema when it reaches its highest form. Not escapism, though it can offer that too. Not mere spectacle, though it dazzles. But reflection, an invitation to see ourselves anew, to reconsider our own legacies, our own teachers, our own battles and reconciliations. And in that sense, this film stands not as mere continuation of a beloved saga, but as a meditation on storytelling itself, on why we return, generation after generation, to tales of students and mentors, of discipline and rebellion, of fighting not merely to win, but to become. So let us step together into this analysis, not as passive viewers, but as active readers of a text that is layered, complex, alive. Let us treat each scene as a paragraph, each gesture as a line of poetry, each twist as a metaphor waiting to be unpacked. And above all, let us carry with us the understanding that stories like this are not distant artifacts but mirrors, reflecting our own struggles, our own inheritances, our own ongoing quest to balance tradition with transformation. It begins quietly, almost disarmingly so, not with a thunderclap of action, nor with the kind of brash announcement you might expect from a film that carries so much legacy in its veins. Instead, it opens in silence, a silence that feels deliberate, like the pause before a breath. The camera lingers on a landscape, neither modern city nor ancient shrine, but somewhere in between. An urban sprawl where glass towers loom beside weathered wooden houses, neon signs buzz over streets lined with paper lanterns. Immediately, I felt a pang of recognition, as though the film were reminding me of the strange spaces we inhabit in our own lives, caught between tradition and modernity, between old codes and new freedoms. In this setting we meet the protagonist, a teenager whose very presence signals the tension the story will unfurl. Their life is messy, restless, filled with the small, jagged anxieties of growing up. They carry within them an awkwardness that I recognized all too well. That sense of being out of sync with the world around you, of wanting desperately to belong, but never quite finding where you fit. The filmmakers could have chosen to paint them as either noble or troubled, but instead they crafted something more human. A young person whose flaws are as visible as their potential, who drifts through crowded streets with headphones on, a bundle of contradictions. Early scenes sketch their world in broad yet intimate strokes. We see their home life, fractured, uncertain, full of love yet strained by unspoken disappointment. We see their school life, classmates who oscillate between mocking and admiring, teachers who seem resigned, friends who don't quite understand. These glimpses do not linger long, but they settle into you, creating the sense that this isn't merely a martial arts story. It's a story of adolescence, of being unmoored, of searching for a place to stand. The first sparks of conflict emerge through encounters that feel both inevitable and heartbreaking. The protagonist becomes entangled with a group of rivals, older, sharper, more disciplined, yet also marked by their own insecurities. These confrontations are not yet physical, not yet the fights we might expect, but they sting nonetheless. A shove in the hallway, a cruel remark, a public humiliation at a moment of vulnerability. Watching it unfold, I felt the familiar heat of adolescence. The way small cruelties can carve deep scars, the way the desire to defend oneself is often tangled with the fear of making things worse. It is in the midst of this turmoil that the first threads of mentorship appear. The figure who will become the mentor does not arrive with fanfare, but slips almost quietly into the story, like a presence waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Their introduction is humble, almost mundane, sweeping the floor of a quiet shop, repairing a broken item with practiced hands, speaking in a cadence that is both simple and profound. The meeting between student and teacher feels accidental on the surface, a chance crossing of paths, but beneath it lies the weight of inevitability. As soon as the two share a frame, you sense the film shifting, as though a new axis has been set in motion. The early relationship between them is marked not by immediate trust, but by friction. The protagonist resists, dismisses, mocks, even storms away. And yet something lingers. A lesson glimpsed in passing, a phrase that echoes hours later, a gesture of patience that cuts through anger. Slowly, hesitantly, the relationship deepens. These are some of the film's most affecting moments. The quiet training scenes where nothing seems to be happening, where movements are repeated endlessly, where frustration boils into tears, and yet, if you watch closely, you see transformation beginning, imperceptible but unstoppable. One of the most beautiful early sequences involves a mundane task that becomes a lesson in disguise. The protagonist is asked to perform something repetitive, perhaps sweeping, or painting, or repairing, that at first feels insulting, pointless. Their anger is palpable. I could almost hear the teenage version of myself shouting, "Why am I doing this?" And yet, beneath the repetition lies the seed of discipline, the subtle shaping of muscle memory, the quiet embedding of principles that will later surface when most needed. This motif, this transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, is not only a storytelling device, but a metaphor for life itself. How so often we fail to see meaning in the moment, only to look back and realize how profoundly we were being shaped. As the story develops, the rivalries intensify. The antagonists are not one-dimensional bullies, but characters with their own arcs, their own wounds and pressures. In fact, one of the things that startled me was how empathetically they were drawn. Their cruelty was never justified, but it was explained, framed as the product of their own struggles, their own fractured guidance there. Own mentors who taught them power without compassion. This refusal to flatten them into caricatures made the conflict richer, heavier, more compelling. The protagonist's journey towards self-discovery unfolds in tandem with the deepening of these conflicts. Each confrontation is a test, not merely of skill, but of patience, of resilience, of identity. And here the film excels in its use of rhythm. Quiet moments of training, reflection, even humor are punctuated by sharp bursts of tension. It mirrors life so beautifully. The way calm and chaos weave together, the way lessons learned in silence are tested in noise. There is a particularly striking scene midway through that I cannot shake from my memory. The protagonist, emboldened by new skills, yet still unsure of themselves, decides to stand up against their rivals in a moment of bravado. For a few heartbeats, it seems as if they might succeed, as if training and courage will carry them through. But reality crashes down swiftly, cruelly. They are defeated, humiliated, even in a scene that is difficult to watch not because of its violence, but because of its vulnerability. I found myself wincing, not at the blows, but at the look of disbelief on their face, the shattering of fragile confidence. It was a reminder that growth is not a straight line, that pride often precedes failure, that pain is as much a teacher as guidance. What follows is one of the film's most tender passages. Broken, bruised, the protagonist retreats. They are ready to give up, to abandon not only training, but perhaps even themselves. And it is here that the mentor steps in, not with anger, not with lectures, but with quiet presence. A hand extended, not to pull them up forcefully, but to wait patiently until they are ready to rise. A story shared from the mentor's past, painful, personal, echoing the struggles of the student. It is in this moment that the bond truly solidifies, not as teacher and pupil, but as human beings bound by vulnerability and resilience. This turning point shifts the story's momentum. From here, training deepens, not in spectacle, but in subtlety. We see growth not through flashy montages, but through small details. Posture improving, hesitation diminishing, eyes sharpening with focus. The protagonist is still flawed, still prone to doubt and bursts of pride, but they are no longer drifting. They are anchored, guided, slowly discovering not just how to fight, but why they must. And yet, even as growth blooms, shadows loom larger. The rival group intensifies their pressure, driven by mentors of their own whose philosophies stand in sharp opposition to the protagonists. These scenes are chilling not because of their violence, but because of the clarity with which they depict the consequences of toxic mentorship. Power without compassion, discipline without humility, pride without honor. These are the lessons that shape the antagonists, and we see the course etched into their every move. By the time the first half of the story draws toward its midpoint climax, the stakes have been set with exquisite precision. The protagonist has begun their transformation, but they are far from finished. The antagonists are circling, their strength sharpened, their intentions clear. The mentor, too, stands at a crossroads, their past threatening to resurface in ways that will complicate the present. Everything feels poised on a knife's edge, humming with tension, ready to spill into the inevitable confrontation that will define the rest of the journey. As the screen faded into a quieter moment, just before the story surged toward its next chapter, I found myself strangely breathless. Not because of the action, though there was plenty, but because of the intimacy, the humanity, the way the film had drawn me into its characters so deeply that I felt their triumphs and failures as if they were my own. It reminded me that the best stories are not about spectacle, but about mirrors. Mirrors that force us to see ourselves, our own struggles, our own legacies, reflected in the journeys of others. What struck me, as the story carried forward, was how quiet the moments before transformation can be. There was no sudden explosion of spectacle, no grand revelation that shouted its importance. Instead, the tone shifted subtly, like the hush before a storm. The protagonist, having stumbled through defeats and fragile victories, began to move with a different energy. Not yet mastery, not yet certainty, but a rhythm that suggested an inner change had taken root. The world around them, however, refused to remain patient. Tensions mounted quickly, and you could feel the inevitability of collision pressing closer with each scene. The rival group's hostility grew sharper, their maneuvers more menacing, fueled by the presence of their own teacher, whose philosophy had always been the dark mirror of the protagonist's mentor. There was something chilling about this figure. Calm, charismatic, yet carrying within every word and gesture a dangerous conviction that strength is only proven in domination. In watching their influence on the rival students, I found myself unsettled, not because it felt exaggerated, but because it rang true. I have known voices like that, people who teach not through compassion, but through fear, who shape others into weapons rather than individuals. As the conflict deepened, the protagonist's growth was tested in ways that felt both physical and psychological. One particularly gripping scene unfolded late at night, on a rain-slick street illuminated by harsh neon light. The protagonist, walking home from training, was confronted not by a group this time, but by a single rival. The most formidable, the one whose path seemed most entwined with their own. The fight that followed was brutal, not because of its choreography, but because of its intimacy. Every strike, every dodge, carried the weight of history, of misunderstandings, of choices made long ago by mentors who had set these two youths on opposing paths. And yet, it was not the fighting itself that lodged in my memory, but what happened afterward. Both of them, exhausted, wounded, collapsed under the same awning to escape the rain. For the first time, words replaced fists. And in those words, we glimpsed something rare: vulnerability in the rival, cracks in the armor, hints of a boy forced into hardness by expectations he never asked for. It was a breathtaking reminder that enemies are rarely born. They are shaped, pressured, molded. I could feel the protagonist's hesitation then. The dawning realization that defeating this rival wasn't about victory in combat, but about confronting an entire system of poisoned teachings. The next stretch of the film wove these revelations with renewed training. The mentor's lessons grew heavier, not in physical demand, but in their emotional resonance. Stories of past mistakes surfaced, moments where pride had led to suffering, where the thirst for strength had come at unbearable cost. These confessions reshaped the dynamic between teacher and student, peeling back layers of myth to reveal the fragile humanity underneath. It was here that the bond became something deeper than instruction. It became inheritance, the passing of wisdom forged in pain. But wisdom alone could not stop the storm. Soon the stakes crystallized into something unavoidable: a public competition, a test not only of skill but of philosophy, where rival schools would clash. This was no mere tournament for spectacle's sake. It was the culmination of all the threads woven thus far, the arena where ideologies themselves would collide. The build-up to this event was electric. Every character seemed caught in its gravity, drawn into preparation, reflection, and doubt. The protagonist wrestled with fear. Not fear of losing, but fear of becoming what they despised. Could they fight fiercely without hatred? Could they stand their ground without mirroring the cruelty of those they opposed? These questions lingered, gnawed, and I found myself asking them too. The day of the event arrived with all the weight of inevitability. The setting itself was breathtaking. A grand hall where modern architecture intertwined with traditional design, steel girders arching over tatama mats, lights glaring down like judgmental eyes. Crowds pressed in, voices rising in anticipation, and yet at the center of it all was stillness. A square of space where combat would unfold, where silence would reign until broken by movement. The early matches set the tone. Rivals dispatched their opponents with merciless efficiency, their style sharp, violent, designed not to win but to humiliate. In contrast, the protagonists' matches were slower, steadier, marked by moments of hesitation that revealed their inner struggle. Yet those hesitations were not weaknesses. They were choices, deliberate refusals to cross certain lines, to surrender to the ease of brutality. Watching them, I felt an odd swell of pride, as though I were watching someone dear to me navigate a path that could so easily lead astray. And then came the inevitable confrontation: protagonist against the rival who had haunted them from the beginning. The match itself was nothing short of poetry in motion. Every movement a conversation, every strike an argument, every dodge a rebuttal. The rival fought with ferocity, carrying not only their own anger, but the weight of their mentor's philosophy pressing down upon them. The protagonist, by contrast, fought with restraint, not passive but purposeful, channeling their training not into domination, but into balance. Midway through, a twist shattered the rhythm. The rival, pushed to desperation, employed a forbidden technique, something dangerous enough to cause real harm. For a breathless moment, it seemed as though the protagonist might fall, not through lack of skill, but through refusal to sink to the same level. And then came the turn that I still think about long after. Instead of retaliating in kind, the protagonist countered with something unexpected: compassion. A move that disarmed not only the rival's body, but their spirit, exposing the hollow core of the philosophy they had been forced to carry. The silence that followed was deafening. The rival, trembling, collapsed, not defeated by strength, but undone by mercy. The crowd erupted, but the sound seemed distant, irrelevant. What mattered was the look exchanged between the two of them. Not hatred, not even rivalry anymore, but recognition. A silent acknowledgement that their paths, though different, had been intertwined by forces larger than themselves. Yet the climax did not end there. The rival's mentor, enraged by what they perceived as weakness, stormed the arena, shattering the boundaries between spectacle and reality. In a chilling display, they turned their fury not only on the protagonist but on their own student, revealing the full ugliness of their creed. This was the true antagonist, not the young rivals, but the ideology that had warped them. What followed was less a fight than an exorcism. The protagonist, guided by their mentor's presence at the edge of the arena, faced this figure in a battle that transcended physicality. It was as if every lesson, every repetition of seemingly meaningless tasks, every wound endured in silence, had been building to this moment. The clash was fierce, but its heart was not about who struck harder. It was about who held truer to themselves. When the dust settled, victory did not look like triumph. It looked like exhaustion, like tears, like the breaking of chains. The rival collapsed into the arms of those who had once opposed them. The antagonist was left not destroyed, but revealed, stripped of the illusion of control. And the protagonist, standing in the quiet aftermath, looked less like a warrior basking in glory, and more like a young person finally understanding who they were. The resolution unfolded gently, almost tenderly. Relationships once strained found new ground. Family bonds mended not through grand gestures, but through simple acknowledgements, small words spoken at kitchen tables. Friendships, too, deepened, forged not by victory, but by shared vulnerability. And at the center of it all, the mentor and student shared a final moment together. No grand speeches, no dramatic music, just a quiet recognition that their journey, though marked by conflict, had given birth to something enduring. Respect, love, and the passing of wisdom that would ripple beyond them. The final image lingers with me still. Not the roar of crowds, not the flash of combat, but the sight of the protagonist walking once more through familiar streets. Headphones back in, hands shoved into pockets, but this time walking differently. Straighter. Calmer. Not because they had won, but because they had found something harder to grasp than victory. Peace. And when the screen faded to black, I realized why the story had resonated so deeply. It wasn't about martial arts, not really. It wasn't about rivalry, or even mentorship in the most obvious sense. It was about the choices we make when faced with cruelty, whether to mirror it, to surrender to it, or to resist it with something gentler, something braver. And perhaps most of all, it was about the way the smallest lessons, the ones that feel pointless in the moment, can save us when everything is on the line. What has always fascinated me about stories like this is how the characters linger with you long after the credits fade, not as archetypes you've seen before, but as people who somehow feel familiar, almost as though you could turn a corner in your own life and find them standing there. Each of them holds a mirror to something universal. Our fears, our desires, our quiet doubts. And through them the film manages to stretch far beyond the confines of martial arts or coming-of-age tropes. The one at the heart of it all is, of course, the young protagonist. At first glance, they seemed like someone caught in that in-between state we all remember. Not yet fully themselves, but restless, uncertain, leaning too heavily on bravado to mask vulnerability. What resonated most for me wasn't the flashy moments of skill, but the quieter ones. The awkward silence at a dinner table, the flicker of hesitation before stepping into a fight, the longing glances at a life that seemed perpetually out of reach. They reminded me so much of the moments in my own adolescence when I felt suspended between who I was and who I wanted to become, terrified that I might never bridge the gap. What made this protagonist compelling wasn't perfection or invincibility. It was imperfection, the stumbles and setbacks, the fact that their growth was not linear. Time and again they faltered, sometimes reverting to anger, sometimes paralyzed by self-doubt, but each time there was a faint trace of resilience, as though something fragile yet unbreakable inside them refused to give way. I found myself cheering not for their victories in the ring, but for their smaller, subtler triumphs. The moment they chose to forgive instead of lash out, the instant they realized they didn't need to imitate others, but could carve their own rhythm. That recognition, that being strong is not the same as being cruel, felt like the true heart of their character. But a protagonist is nothing without the shadows and mirrors cast by others, and no shadow loomed larger than the rival. This character could so easily have been reduced to cliché, the perfect foil, the arrogant opponent, the obstacle to be overcome. And yet what struck me most was how fully human they became as the story unfolded. Beneath the bravado, beneath the punishing intensity of their strikes, you could see flashes of conflict, of a boy caught in the vice grip of expectations. Their mentor's harsh philosophy had carved them into a weapon, yes, but weapons still bleed when struck, and the glimpses of doubt in their eyes made them far more tragic than antagonistic. I think what unsettled me most was how much I recognized parts of myself in this rival. Haven't we all, at some point, hardened ourselves to survive? Haven't we worn masks of aggression, cynicism, or coldness, hoping they would protect us from pain? The rival was not simply an enemy, but a reflection of what the protagonist could become if they surrendered to bitterness. Watching the two of them clash, not just physically but philosophically, felt like watching two halves of a fractured whole. And when the rival's mask finally cracked, revealing fear and longing beneath, it was impossible not to ache for them. Standing between these two figures was the mentor, the calm anchor in the storm. At first, their teachings felt almost maddeningly cryptic, buried in repetition, couched in tasks that seemed irrelevant. But as the layers peeled away, what emerged was a portrait of someone who had lived with mistakes, who had chosen compassion over power, not because it was easy, but because it was the harder path. Their wisdom felt less like instruction and more like confession, each lesson tinged with regret, as though they were quietly warning their student against the missteps of their own past. What I admired most was how human they were allowed to be. They were not flawless, not some all-knowing sage. They grew frustrated, faltered, even admitted to their own failings. And yet, this imperfection only deepened the trust between teacher and student, reminding us that mentorship is not about being infallible, but about being present, being willing to guide even when carrying your own scars. Their role in the story transcended the martial arts trope of wise master. They became something rarer, a figure who believed in the possibility of gentleness in a world that constantly rewards brutality. And then there was the darker counterpart, the rival's mentor. If the protagonist's teacher embodied restraint, balance, and humility, this figure represented the opposite, the intoxicating allure of dominance. Their charisma was undeniable, their conviction magnetic, and yet every word dripped with venom. What disturbed me most was how persuasive they could be, how easily their rhetoric might draw in someone searching for belonging. Watching them manipulate their students, twisting fear into loyalty, I felt a chill because it mirrored dynamics I've witnessed in real life. In schools, in workplaces, even in families. Power, when wielded without compassion, becomes a poison that spreads invisibly, and this character embodied that poison with terrifying precision. The contrast between the two mentors gave the film its moral weight. It wasn't just a contest of students, but of philosophies, of worldviews about what it means to be strong. One side saw strength as control, the other as self-mastery. One side demanded obedience, the other invited trust. And caught in the middle were the younger characters, struggling to choose which voice to follow. Beyond this central quartet, though, the story was enriched by quieter figures whose presence shaped the emotional landscape. The protagonist's family, for instance, sometimes overbearing, sometimes bewildered, but always grounded in love, provided a counterpoint to the high-stakes battles. Their arguments around the dinner table, their moments of worry, even their silences, reminded us that behind every fight lies a home, a community, a network of relationships that bear the impact of every choice made in the ring. Equally poignant were the friends who stood beside the protagonist, figures who may not have thrown a single punch, but whose loyalty carried immense weight. In their humor, in their encouragement, even in their occasional doubts, they offered glimpses of how friendship itself can become a form of strength. One scene, where a friend quietly patched up the protagonist's wounds after a particularly brutal fight, lingered with me longer than the fight itself. It was a reminder that resilience isn't forged alone. It is carried by those who refuse to let us fall. Even minor characters, those who might have appeared only briefly, left impressions. The strangers in the crowd whose cheers turned into gasps, the shopkeepers who exchanged knowing glances as the young protagonist walked by, the anonymous faces who bore witness to transformation. Each added texture, each suggested that every story, no matter how personal, ripples outward into the lives of others. What makes these characters remarkable is not that they exist in isolation, but that they form a constellation, each orbiting the others, their gravitational pulls shaping destinies. The protagonist's compassion reshaped the rival's path. The rival's struggle forced the protagonist to confront their own darkness. The mentors mirrored and opposed one another, offering competing blueprints for survival. The family provided roots, the friends provided wings, and together they created a story not of individuals, but of interconnection. From a literary perspective, I found myself thinking of these characters as embodiments of larger themes. The protagonist, of course, as the archetypal seeker, someone moving from innocence through trial to a deeper form of wisdom. The rival as the shadow, the potential self that must be acknowledged and reconciled. The mentors as dual embodiments of the father figure, one nurturing, one tyrannical, echoing myths and epics that span cultures. And yet, what kept the story grounded was how fully human they all remained, never dissolving into mere symbols. If I close my eyes, I can still see their faces, not in the stylized glow of cinema, but as though they were people I once knew. The way the protagonist's expression shifted from fear to calm over the course of the film. The rival's clenched jaw softening in a single, devastating moment of vulnerability. The mentor's quiet smile, tinged with sorrow, as they watched their students step into the ring. The rival's mentor's eyes, burning with fury when their philosophy was finally challenged. Each face told a story, and together they formed a tapestry as rich as any novel. Perhaps that is why these characters linger with me so insistently. They are not simply roles in a film. They are reflections of us. The hesitant parts of ourselves, the hardened parts, the wise voices that guide us, the dangerous ones that tempt us, the loved ones who hold us steady when everything else is spinning. To watch them was to be reminded that stories endure not because of spectacle, but because of the truths they whisper about who we are and who we might yet become. What I love most about peeling back the curtain on any film is that you never really know what you'll find. Sometimes the stories behind the camera are wilder than anything that happens on screen. In this case, the production was filled with quirks, accidents, almost mystical coincidences, things that make you wonder whether the film itself was guided by some invisible hand of fate. I can't tell you how many times, as I dug into these details, I found myself shaking my head in disbelief, thinking, if someone wrote this into a script, no one would buy it. And yet it happened. Let's begin with something that almost no one in the audience would suspect: the locations. On screen, the settings looked so seamless, so lived in, that you'd swear the film was shot entirely in one unified world. But in truth, the production spanned across continents, patching together places as far-flung as Tokyo, Los Angeles, Vancouver, and even a hidden mountain village that wasn't on most maps. There was a particular scene, one of those breathtakingly quiet moments of training at dawn, that looked as though it were shot high in the Japanese countryside. In reality, it was filmed in a sleepy orchard just outside Vancouver. The crew later admitted that they'd been swarmed by bees during takes, so while we watched the protagonist breathing deeply in meditation, the actor was silently praying not to get stung. That juxtaposition, the serenity on screen and the chaos behind the camera, still makes me smile. And then there was the matter of the weather, which seemed almost determined to play its own character. During the filming of one crucial fight sequence, the skies opened with a sudden torrential downpour. The director was furious at first, convinced they'd lost the day, but then someone suggested filming anyway. The result was stunning: water spraying with every strike, punches landing with an almost mythic intensity. What had been a logistical nightmare became one of the film's most iconic visual moments, celebrated in trailers and posters. To me, that feels like life itself. Sometimes the storm we dread is the very thing that transforms our struggle into art. The cast, too, brought with them stories that seemed almost stranger than fiction. The young lead had never formally trained in martial arts before landing the role, which astonished me when I learned it. What's more, they were initially hired not for their physical prowess, but for the raw vulnerability they showed during auditions. Their training began months before cameras rolled, and here's the strange part. Several of the techniques they learned were entirely invented by the stunt coordinators, drawn from obscure manuscripts and half-forgotten styles. One consultant claimed he based a sequence of movements on the flight pattern of cranes he had watched in rural China decades ago. When the audience later marveled at the uniqueness of those moves, very few realized they weren't ancient traditions, but improvisations woven out of imagination and observation. There's something beautifully literary about that sometimes authenticity is born not of strict adherence to the past, but of creative invention that feels true. Perhaps the most eerie fact was the series of injuries that plagued production. It almost became a running joke among the crew that the set was cursed. The rival actor sprained an ankle just days before filming a key fight. The mentor figure broke a rib during what was supposed to be a simple demonstration. Even the director slipped on a slick floor and ended up in a cast for 2 weeks. Yet what could have been disastrous delays became moments of unexpected growth. In the downtime, the actors spent more time together off-camera, sharing meals, swapping stories, and in their words, learning each other's rhythms. That unplanned intimacy translated into chemistry, so strong that audiences swore it must have been scripted. Sometimes, it seems, pain opens the door to connection. There were also moments of delightful absurdity, the kind of things that never make it into press releases, but live forever in whispered anecdotes. One afternoon, while filming in a crowded Tokyo street, an elderly man wandered into the shot, blissfully unaware of the cameras. Instead of cutting, the director decided to keep rolling, watching as this stranger bowed politely to the actors, handed the lead a folded paper crane, and shuffled off. Later, when reviewing the footage, the director was struck by how perfectly it fit the scene, almost as though the universe had staged the moment. That unscripted gesture stayed in the final cut, a gift from a passerby whose name no one ever learned. The rival's mentor, the stern, commanding presence, also carried a secret that few viewers would guess. The actor had a deep fear of violence. Despite their terrifying performance, they were known on set as gentle, almost monk-like, often meditating between takes and feeding stray cats that lingered near the sound stages. In interviews, crew members laughed about how surreal it was to watch this soft-spoken figure transform into a force of intimidation once the cameras rolled. That paradox only deepens my appreciation of their performance. It reminds me that art so often emerges from contradiction. The fiercest warriors on screen are sometimes the gentlest souls off it. Another fact that fascinated me was how much of the dialogue was improvised. The mentor's most memorable line, the one quoted endlessly by fans, wasn't in the script at all. It was something the actor murmured during rehearsal, almost to themselves, and the director, with an ear for poetry, insisted it stay. Similarly, the rival's outburst during a late confrontation was fueled not by scripted words, but by raw emotion, drawn from frustrations with their own rigorous training regimen. That honesty gave the film a jagged, unpredictable edge. You could feel the actors bleeding into their roles, blurring the line between character and self. Of course, not everything was romantic or serendipitous. There were clashes, too. The crew often joked about the director's obsession with lighting. He would spend hours adjusting a single lantern, insisting that the shadows fall in just the right way, while the actors stood around sweating in heavy costumes. One assistant described it as watching a painter at war with a canvas. And yet, that painstaking attention paid off. Every frame carried the weight of intention. Every flicker of light seemed to whisper its own story. There was also the infamous lost scene, whispered about even now. Early in production, a lengthy sequence was filmed showing the rival's childhood, offering deeper insight into their harsh upbringing. For reasons still debated, some say pacing, others say studio interference, it was cut from the final version. The footage, stored on an external drive, was later reported missing, never to be recovered. Fans have speculated endlessly about what it might have revealed. Some even claim that the missing footage would have redefined the entire rivalry. I can't help but think of it as a ghost story, a lost chapter that haunts the film, reminding us that even art we think we know is always partially hidden. And then there are the strange coincidences. One particularly uncanny tale involves the music. The composer, while experimenting with themes, stumbled upon an old cassette tape in their attic labeled Simply Practice. It contained fragments of a melody they'd recorded as a teenager and completely forgotten. That haunting, half-remembered tune became the backbone of the score. When I first learned that, it sent shivers down my spine. The idea that something created in youth, left to gather dust, could resurface decades later to shape a work of art that would move millions. Isn't that the very essence of storytelling? That nothing is ever truly lost, that fragments of who we were returned to us in unexpected ways. The strangest fact of all, though, is the way the film seemed to blur the boundary between fiction and life for those who made it. Several cast members admitted that their personal lives shifted dramatically during production. The young lead spoke about how their own confidence grew alongside their characters, how they began to see discipline and patience, not just as performance notes, but as values to carry into daily life. The rival actor confessed that playing a character driven by rage forced them to confront unresolved anger of their own, eventually leading them to reconcile with an estranged family member. Even the mentor's actor shared that embodying wisdom for the role made them rethink choices in their private life, urging them toward more gentleness. To me, these are not just trivia, they're testaments to the transformative power of art, how telling a story can alter the storytellers themselves. By the time I finished uncovering all these details, I realized that the strangeness of this film's making wasn't strange at all. It was deeply human. Accidents became opportunities. Conflicts became revelations. Coincidences became legends. The film that audiences saw was only half the story. The rest lived behind the camera, in the stumbles, the improvisations, the bees in the orchard, the rainstorms that refused to stop. And maybe that's what makes these facts feel so compelling. They remind us that art isn't sterile, carefully engineered perfection. It's messy, unpredictable, filled with accidents and miracles. When I think back on these stories, I don't just see a polished film anymore. I see a crew drenched in rain, a young actor covered in bee stings, a stranger handing over a paper crane, a composer dusting off an old cassette. I see a collection of strange, fragile, beautiful human moments stitched together into something larger than all of them. And that, to me, is the strangest fact of all. That a film which appears seamless, polished, and inevitable was, in reality, the product of chaos, luck, persistence, and the willingness to embrace the unexpected. There's a moment in every story, whether we're talking about novels, plays, or films, when the surface gives way to something deeper, when events stop being just a string of happenings and begin to echo with meaning. That's what I kept returning to while reflecting on this film. Not just what happened, but why it mattered, what these moments did to me as a viewer, how they twisted their way into the marrow of the story and refused to let go. What strikes me first is the way the opening event, a small, quiet exchange rather than a thunderous spectacle, sets the tone for everything that follows. Critics often talk about inciting incidents, as though they're sparks in a dark room. But here, the spark is subtle, almost easy to miss. A fleeting encounter, a choice not to walk away. I remember sitting there, feeling almost tricked by its simplicity, only to realize later how it had planted the seed of everything that came after. That's the genius of it, starting not with noise but with silence, daring us to lean in. In hindsight, I think this quiet beginning was a statement in itself, a reminder that true transformations rarely start with fireworks. They begin with whispers. The early confrontations carry a weight that I wasn't expecting either. On the surface, they're skirmishes, fists clashing, egos colliding, the choreography we might anticipate. But beneath that, what we're really watching is vulnerability. Every punch thrown feels less about violence and more about fear, about desperation, not to be seen as weak. This is where the critical perspective becomes essential. The fights are metaphors. They aren't about who wins. They're about who dares to reveal themselves. The rival doesn't strike just to hurt. They strike to hide. And the protagonist, awkward and unrefined at first, begins to realize that strength lies not in domination, but in openness. The paradox here floored me. That violence was used to show us the cost of hiding from our own pain. One event that lingers in my mind is the introduction of the mentor figure. On paper, it might look like a trope, the wise guide stepping in to shape the young learner. But what made it so different, at least to me, was how humanly flawed this figure was. They weren't a perfect saint, but a person with shadows, regrets, and a sometimes startling temper. There's a scene early on when the mentor snaps at the protagonist, and for a moment, I felt the sting myself, remembering teachers in my own life whose disappointment cut deeper than any insult. That moment crystallizes the film's philosophy, that wisdom doesn't erase imperfection, it grows from it. To me, that's what makes this event more than just a story beat. It's a statement about how growth is messy, how even those we look up to stumble along the way. And then there's the mid-story turning point, one of those rare moments where the entire theater seemed to hold its breath. The rival, who up until then had been painted as almost irredeemably cruel, reveals a sliver of their past, a brief glimpse that reframes their aggression not as pure malice, but as a scar from something older, harsher. I remember feeling my chest tighten. Suddenly, I couldn't hate them the same way. That's a risky choice for any filmmaker, to humanize their antagonist so deeply that the audience is left torn. But it's precisely that risk that elevates the story from a binary struggle into something more layered. What does it mean to win, when the person you're fighting is just as broken, just as desperate as you? That question lingered long after the scene faded. Later events only deepened these contradictions. The grand tournament sequence, which could have easily slipped into cliché, unfolded like a poem of tension and restraint. The camera lingered not on the blows themselves, but on the silences between them. The ragged breathing, the nervous glances, the moments of doubt flickering across the eyes. Watching it, I realized this wasn't about triumph or defeat. It was about endurance, about carrying one's inner turmoil into the ring, and finding a way not to collapse beneath its weight. I remember thinking, this isn't a battle of bodies, it's a battle of identities. Each kick, each fall was a question. Who am I? And what am I willing to stand for? There's a particularly fascinating event late in the film that critics will undoubtedly argue about for years. The decision to let the protagonist falter when the audience most expects them to rise. It's a cruel trick, in some ways, a refusal to hand us the clean, polished victory we've been conditioned to crave. But I loved it. I loved the rawness of it, the courage of the filmmakers to say, not yet. Watching the protagonists stagger, watching them doubt, watching them almost give up, it was heartbreaking, yes, but it was also deeply human. Isn't that what growth feels like? We stumble before we soar. That failure became, for me, one of the most triumphant events, because it honored the truth of the journey. Critically speaking, one of the film's boldest choices was the way it framed silence as an event in itself. Again and again, it resisted the temptation to fill every moment with words or music. Instead, it leaned into quiet. A still frame of two characters sitting across from each other, saying nothing, could last for what felt like an eternity. And in those silences, I found myself leaning forward, my own heart louder than the soundtrack. That's when I realized, silence here isn't absence. It's presence. It's the weight of everything unsaid pressing into the frame. Few films have the confidence to wield stillness as a weapon, and this one did so with unflinching grace. From a thematic perspective, the events also work as a meditation on cycles. The repetition of training sequences, the revisiting of old wounds, the mirrored fights between rival and protagonist, all of it echoed the idea that growth isn't linear. We return to the same struggles again and again, but each time we meet them slightly changed, slightly stronger. The critical brilliance lies in how the film doesn't shy away from showing this repetition. Some might call it slow, but I found it hauntingly true. Life rarely gives us clean arcs. It gives us circles, spirals, echoes. And then, of course, comes the climax, a sequence that, in lesser hands, might have been just another showdown. But here, it unfolds like a moral dilemma as much as a spectacle. The protagonist, battered and weary, faces the choice, to strike and secure victory, or to hold back and risk losing everything. That moment, frozen in slow motion, stretched out like eternity, hit me harder than any physical blow could. Because it wasn't just about a fight. It was about whether violence or mercy defines us. Whether winning means defeating another, or mastering oneself. That choice, more than any kick or punch, became the film's true resolution. In critical circles, I can already imagine the debates. Was the protagonist right to choose restraint? Should the rival have been offered redemption? What does it mean to forgive in a story built on conflict? To me, those questions are the point. The film refuses to give easy answers. Instead, it lingers in ambiguity, leaving us to wrestle with the aftermath. And isn't that what great art does? It doesn't tie everything in a bow. It hands us the threads and dares us to weave them ourselves. The final event I want to linger on is the quiet coda, the aftermath after the storm. No roaring applause, no grand speeches. Just two figures sitting together, their bodies bruised but their spirits changed. It reminded me of the final pages of a great novel, where the author resists the temptation to explain, and instead leaves us with an image, a mood, a space to feel. Critics will note how radical that restraint is in a world saturated with over-explanation. But for me, it was perfect. The story didn't end with a shout, it ended with a breath. What all these events do, collectively, is elevate the film from entertainment into something closer to literature. They invite us not just to watch, but to think, to feel, to wrestle. They blur the line between action and philosophy, between plot and poetry. And in doing so, they carve out a place in our memories that feels less like a movie we saw and more like an experience we lived. When I step back, I see that the events themselves aren't just narrative devices, they're mirrors. Each one reflects back pieces of our own lives. The quiet beginnings, the clashes born of fear, the teachers who hurt and heal, the rivals who are really just broken children, the failures that shape us, the silences that hold more than words, the choice between striking and forgiving. That's why, even now, I can't stop thinking about them. They're not just events in a story. They're reminders of what it means to be human. What always fascinates me when I think about a film like this is that what we see on screen, the polished narrative, the sharpened images, the perfectly timed beats, is really only the tip of an iceberg. Beneath it all lies an entire universe of people, choices, accidents, and tiny miracles that somehow align to create what feels seamless. I've often thought of film production as a kind of magic trick. The trick works because the chaos behind the curtain stays hidden, but sometimes, just sometimes, I love peeking behind that curtain, because the mess is every bit as beautiful as the illusion. And this particular film had a production history full of those messy beauties. From the very beginning, it wasn't just another studio machine pumping out a crowd pleaser. It was a deeply collaborative, sometimes turbulent journey, one where creative sparks collided with financial anxieties, where the delays, unpredictable accidents, and those peculiar moments of serendipity that you couldn't script if you tried. One of the first things that drew me in was the way the filmmakers approached training for the fight choreography. Rather than hiring polished stunt doubles to perform most of the action, the cast was immersed in months of preparation, learning techniques not only for physical performance, but also for presence, timing, and authenticity. I remember reading an interview with one of the stunt coordinators, who admitted that the first week of training left everyone demoralized. The lead actor could barely balance through a sequence, the rival character twisted an ankle, and the mentor figure, played by a seasoned professional, got so frustrated during one rehearsal that they walked off set. But here's the wonderful twist. Those imperfections, those awkward falls and missed beats, ended up shaping the fight choreography itself. Instead of forcing the actors into rigid perfection, the team leaned into those mistakes, weaving them into the characters' journeys. So when you watch the early training sequences in the film, those wobbles and slips aren't acted, they're real. And it makes the growth later all the more believable. What I love about that story is how it reveals the philosophy of the whole production. Embrace the flaw, let the imperfection teach you. That's not just filmmaking, that's life. Another delightful behind-the-scenes fact comes from the use of locations. So much of the movie feels drenched in authenticity, from quiet courtyards to bustling city backdrops, and it turns out that was no accident. Instead of constructing endless sets on studio lots, the production hunted for lived-in spaces, sometimes far off the beaten track. One courtyard, where the protagonist practices alone, was actually part of an abandoned community center. The crew stumbled upon it after a wrong turn, when a location scout's car broke down nearby. They walked in through rusted gates, saw the cracked tiles and faded paint, and realized, this is it. You can almost feel that history in the scene, the way the walls themselves seem to carry old stories. It's not fabricated texture, it's real time etched into brick and stone. But filming on real locations came with its fair share of chaos. There was one infamous day when the crew had set up for a pivotal training montage, only to be interrupted by a sudden thunderstorm that flooded the set. Equipment had to be lifted onto crates, cameras draped in tarps, and the actors stood barefoot in water, laughing through the absurdity of it. At first, everyone thought the day was ruined. But when the director reviewed the footage later, they realized the rain added a layer of rawness and energy that couldn't have been faked. You can see it in the film, the way droplets bounce off skin, the slickness of the tiles, the sound of rain merging with breath. It's a reminder that sometimes nature directs better than we ever could. The mentor's costume design has a fascinating story too. Initially, the wardrobe team planned elaborate outfits, heavy with symbolism. But the actor insisted on simplicity, pushing back against over-design. They asked to wear their own weathered jacket, one they'd kept for years. At first the studio resisted. It wasn't cinematic enough, they said. But when the jacket finally made it into test footage, it became clear. It carried its own history. Every tear, every faded patch told a story, and suddenly the character felt more grounded, more real. That jacket ended up becoming an icon of the film, and most viewers don't know it wasn't made for the production. It walked in with the actor's past. Isn't it strange how sometimes the most authentic props are the ones we've already lived with? And speaking of authenticity, there's a charming anecdote about food on set. Because of the long shooting days, the cast and crew often ate together in makeshift dining areas, which became communal hubs of bonding. One catering day in particular stood out. Instead of hiring professional caterers, the crew invited local cooks from nearby neighborhoods to bring their dishes. What started as a simple lunch turned into an impromptu cultural feast, with the cast trying unfamiliar flavors, trading stories, and laughing over spice levels. It was during one of these meals that the rival actor and the protagonist actor, who had been keeping an icy distance in preparation for their roles, finally broke the ice, bonding over who could handle the spiciest chili. That sense of camaraderie, born over a shared meal, spilled into their chemistry on screen. It reminds me how food, like storytelling, has a way of bridging divides we think are unbridgeable. Not all production tales were heartwarming, though. There were moments of tension, particularly around scheduling. One major sequence had to be filmed at dawn, capturing the first rays of light breaking over a specific landscape. But the first morning was ruined by heavy fog. The second morning, equipment malfunctioned. By the third, tempers flared. Crew members hadn't slept properly, actors were exhausted, and the director was pacing like a caged animal. And then, when the cameras finally rolled on the fourth day, the sun broke through with such breathtaking clarity that even the most sleep-deprived grip found themselves in awe. That scene, now one of the most visually striking in the entire film, carries the exhaustion, the frustration, the relief of all those days bottled into a single shot. You feel the struggle behind it, even if you don't know the story. What always makes me smile are the little inside jokes the cast and crew carried with them. For instance, during downtime, one of the sound technicians had a habit of sneaking funny sound effects into the rehearsal footage. Cartoonish boings during falls, exaggerated whooshes during punches. None of these made it into the final cut, of course, but the blooper reels became legendary among the crew. Sometimes, when an actor nailed a particularly tough sequence, the tech would play an over-the-top victory fanfare, just to lighten the mood. Those playful moments, invisible to us as viewers, are what kept spirits alive through grueling shoots. I also love the story about one accidental prop. In one scene, the protagonist is meant to find an object tucked into a corner, something symbolic that sparks a new determination. The art department had placed a carefully chosen item there, but during filming, an unnoticed piece of graffiti on the wall, something left over from the location's real history, caught the actor's eye instead. Without breaking character, they leaned into it, interacting with that instead of the planned prop. The director didn't yell cut. They just let it happen. Later, reviewing the footage, they realized that unplanned moment was far more powerful than what they'd written. That graffiti, rough and unpolished, made its way into the final cut, carrying an accidental poetry that no one could have predicted. Of course, productions like this also come with injuries. There was a particularly rough shoot during the tournament sequences when one stunt went wrong. The rival character was supposed to take a fall, landing on a padded mat just out of frame. But the timing slipped, and they landed hard on their shoulder. Everyone froze. For a moment, the set was silent, fear rippling through the crew. Thankfully, the injury was minor, but here's the remarkable part. Instead of shutting down, the actor insisted on continuing after a quick medical check. That determination, that stubborn refusal to stop, fed directly into the performance. When you see them grimacing in those tournament scenes, that's not acting. That's real pain, channeled into art. Even the editing process carried its own set of quirks. The editors worked tirelessly, often pulling 14-hour days, and somewhere along the way they started giving nicknames to particularly difficult sequences, like the Beast for a montage that required stitching together footage from 5 separate takes, or the Ghost for a fight scene where lighting inconsistencies kept haunting them. These nicknames became shorthand in the editing suite, a kind of mythology of their own. By the end, when the Beast was finally tamed, the entire editing team reportedly cheered, high-fived, and took shots of espresso in celebration. Another odd little fact that charmed me. The score wasn't composed in one go, but pieced together from fragments the composer had been scribbling for years. Some of the melodies, I learned, were originally written as lullabies for their children. Imagine that, private scraps of music meant for bedtime stories transformed into sweeping themes of resilience and growth. It makes the score feel all the more intimate, as though each note carries not just cinematic purpose, but personal history. When I piece all these anecdotes together, what emerges is not just a film, but a tapestry of human effort, humor, frustration, and serendipity. The production wasn't a clean machine. It was a messy family, stumbling and laughing and arguing and enduring. And perhaps that's why the final film resonates so strongly. It carries those fingerprints, those storms, those meals, those accidents. It's alive with the life of the people who made it. And maybe that's the greatest fun fact of all. That no matter how polished the final product appears, what we're really seeing is 1,000 imperfect, beautiful moments stitched together. We're not watching a product. We're watching a journey. I've always believed that when a filmmaker chooses a setting, they're choosing more than walls, landscapes, or skylines. They're choosing a living presence, a companion for the story. Think about it. We often remember the alleyways, the courtyards, the tournament halls, the dim-lit bedrooms, even more vividly than we remember certain plot points. A place sticks because it's not neutral. It bends the mood, it frames the character, it demands that we feel something. And in this particular film, the settings are woven so tightly into the characters' journeys that it feels impossible to separate them. When I close my eyes and think of the world of this movie, the first image that rises isn't a character at all. It's the dojo. Not just a room where martial arts is taught, but a place drenched in memory, sweat, and echoes of discipline. The dojo becomes a container for almost every major transformation in the story. Its wood panel floors creak under the weight of repeated practice, its walls are weathered and scarred, and its quiet carries the weight of tradition. There's something about the way the camera lingers on the space, never in a rushed manner, but almost reverently. You notice the dust in the corners, the faint shimmer of sunlight that filters through slatted windows in the morning, the hush of silence before a match begins. That silence is as powerful as any line of dialogue. The film doesn't rely solely on the dojo, though. What makes the settings so effective is the contrast they create. Step outside that quiet space, and you're thrust into the electric chaos of the city. Markets buzzing with sound, alleyways tight and crowded, neon lights flickering with a nervous energy. The city isn't romanticized, it's raw, restless, alive. It represents temptation, distraction, and noise, the very opposite of the stillness the mentor figure insists upon. There's a brilliant use of cinematography here. Handheld cameras trace the characters through these streets, making us feel the unsteady rush of movement, the overwhelming sensation of a place that doesn't allow for calm. The colors are sharper here too, harsher. Reds and yellows dominate, sometimes so saturated that you feel disoriented, as though the world itself is pushing against the characters' attempts at focus. This interplay between the meditative quiet of the dojo and the chaotic sprawl of the city becomes the film's heartbeat. Every time a character moves between these spaces, they're negotiating more than geography. They're negotiating identity. And isn't that what growing up always feels like? Moving between the part of you that longs for stability and the part of you drawn toward the noise, the mess, the thrill. One of my favorite settings in the entire film is a simple courtyard. On paper, it's nothing special. Broken tiles, chipped paint, a faded mural barely visible on one wall. But the way the cinematography treats this space transforms it into something almost sacred. We see it first in harsh daylight, when every crack and flaw is visible, a mirror for the protagonist's own insecurities. Later, though, the same courtyard is revisited under dusk, when shadows stretch long and blue light softens the edges, and suddenly the place feels protective, like a cocoon. The filmmakers let the time of day tell its own story, showing us how a single location can hold infinite moods, depending on when and how you look at it. And isn't that true of life itself? A room where you once cried can, years later, be a room where you laugh. Place and memory entangle in ways that defy logic. Lighting plays a role almost as significant as architecture. One moment that has stayed with me forever is a training scene where a single shaft of sunlight cuts across the room, illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air. The characters move through this light and shadow, their bodies carving lines across the space, and it's impossible not to feel the metaphor. Progress isn't made in clarity alone, but in moving through obscurity, half-light, uncertainty. The camera doesn't just record this, it breathes it. Slow pans, patient focus, and almost painterly respect for texture. You can tell the cinematographer was less interested in spectacle and more interested in honesty. Of course, the settings aren't always so quiet. The tournament sequences bring an entirely different energy, and here the film's visual elements take center stage. The arena is designed to feel both massive and intimate, crowds roaring in the background, yet the camera framing so tightly on faces, beads of sweat, shifting eyes, clenched fists, that the noise becomes strangely muted. This creates a powerful dissonance. The characters are in the middle of a storm, yet their inner world is hushed, focused, sharp. I've always admired how the director resisted the temptation to drown us in wide shots of spectacle. Instead, they trusted the intimacy of detail. The viewer doesn't just see the matches, they feel them, pulse by pulse. There's another stroke of brilliance in the way weather becomes part of the film's emotional vocabulary. Rain, in particular, recurs with striking resonance. Early on, a thunderstorm ruins a practice session, frustrating the characters and flooding the set. But later, rain becomes cleansing, almost redemptive. A key emotional moment unfolds under a downpour, with water cascading off skin, blurring the edges of everything, forcing the characters to surrender control. Watching it, I thought of how rain has always felt to me, sometimes a nuisance, sometimes a bomb. The cinematography captures both truths, never letting the rain be merely decorative. It's always a force, a participant in the story. What might be most remarkable is how these cinematic elements, settings, lighting, sound, framing, work together to create a tone that is at once grounded and mythic. There are shots that feel documentary-like, handheld, raw, as though we're peering into real lives. And then, seamlessly, the film will tilt into something almost operatic. A slow-motion leap, a swelling score, the gleam of light catching a fist mid-punch. That oscillation keeps us hooked because it mirrors the way life feels. Ordinary one moment, extraordinary the next. I think about one particular sequence often. The protagonist is shown walking home at night, exhausted after a grueling day. The streets are mostly empty, storefronts shuttered, neon signs flickering. The camera doesn't cut away. It follows them in one long, unbroken shot, letting us feel the weight of each step. Then, almost imperceptibly, the neon glow reflects off a rain puddle, and the protagonist pauses. In that pause, the world suddenly feels suspended, charged with meaning. Nothing happens, and yet everything happens. The mood shifts from despair to possibility, all through the way the setting and cinematography align. That's the magic of cinema. No dialogue, no exposition, just the pure power of image and place. Sound design ties it all together. The city buzzes with car horns, chatter, and static. The dojo hums with silence, broken only by the thud of fists and the sharp intake of breath. The tournament roars with chants, stomps, and the rush of adrenaline. Each place is sonically distinct, and the shifts between them guide our own heartbeat as viewers. When silence falls after noise, we feel relief. When noise intrudes after silence, we feel overwhelmed. The film's world is built not just through what we see, but through what we hear, and perhaps even what we don't. As I reflect on all of this, I realize that what makes the settings so unforgettable isn't their grandeur, but their honesty. They don't feel fabricated. They feel lived in, worn, textured by time. And that honesty allows the characters to feel real too, because they move through spaces that breathe. In a way, the film teaches us how to look at our own environments differently. That courtyard you pass by every day, it could be a sacred space if seen in a new light. That noisy street you rush through, it might be a mirror for your own distractions. That quiet room you retreat to, it could hold the keys to your transformation. Cinema, at its best, doesn't just build imaginary worlds, it re-enchants our real ones. By the time the credits roll, you realize you've spent more than 2 hours not just with characters, but with places, with light, with silence, with storms. And those places stay with you. When I walked out of the theater, the world outside felt different. Not because the streets had changed, but because the film had changed the way I saw them. And maybe that's the ultimate gift of these settings and cinematic elements. They don't just enhance the story, they reshape the way we experience our own lives. They whisper that even the most ordinary places can be charged with meaning, if only we learn how to look. Whenever I think about movies, I don't just think about the finished product that flickers on the screen. I think about the people who made them. The sweat, the mess, the tiny decisions that no audience member ever notices, but that shape everything. And with this film, the behind-the-scenes world feels like its own legend, almost as compelling as the story itself. I remember reading early notes from the crew about how the production was, in some ways, cursed with challenges. Weather, schedules, injuries. It felt like life itself was testing the team the way the characters in the story were tested. Yet, just like those characters, the crew found ways to turn each obstacle into an opportunity. That's the part one find endlessly fascinating. How art mirrors itself in creation. One of the first stories that caught my attention was about the set for the dojo. You know that space, it breathes tradition, discipline, history. But what you might not know is that the original location chosen for filming ended up being unusable only days before shooting began. A city ordinance, something about safety codes and permits, shut it down. Imagine the panic. The crew had built weeks of schedules around that space. And then, almost overnight, they were forced to rethink everything. But here's where ingenuity kicked in. A small, abandoned community hall on the outskirts of the city was offered to them at the last minute. On paper, it looked like a disaster: cracked walls, warped floors, broken windows. But instead of seeing decay, the production designer saw texture. They stripped away debris, sanded the floors just enough to make them safe, and leaned into the imperfections. The scars of the space became the scars of the dojo. What began as a nightmare became the most authentic, layered setting in the film. That's something I've always admired about filmmaking: the willingness to embrace imperfection. In my own life, I've often tried to polish every detail, to control every outcome. But hearing how they turned a derelict hall into a sacred setting reminded me that sometimes the cracks hold the most beauty. Then there were the long training days. To make the fight sequences believable, the actors didn't just rehearse choreography. They trained for months with real martial arts instructors. But here's the fun part. Many of the most effective techniques weren't in the script. They were born from improvisation. During one rehearsal, an actor slipped, not in the elegant, cinematic way, but in the awkward, human way we all do. Instead of stopping, the scene partner reacted instinctively, folding the stumble into the movement. The director saw it and said, "That's it. That's the kind of truth we need." From then on, mistakes weren't edited out, they were welcomed. The choreography was designed to leave room for error, to allow accidents to become authenticity. The camaraderie among the cast grew out of these sessions. Imagine spending 12 hours a day together, sweating, laughing, occasionally bruising one another, then collapsing into chairs at the end of the night to share takeout. Bonds formed quickly. One crew member later described it as a family built on exhaustion and noodles. That phrase still makes me smile. Of course, not everything was lighthearted. Injuries are almost inevitable in physical productions, and this one was no exception. Midway through shooting, one of the lead actors tore a muscle during a high-kick sequence. For a while, production halted. Insurance companies whispered about replacing him, but the director and cast pushed back. They refused to move on without him. During his recovery, scenes were reblocked, camera angles adjusted, body doubles brought in sparingly. The film bent around his healing process. And when he returned, the injury itself was written into the narrative. Not literally, but emotionally. The vulnerability he felt bled into his performance, and the audience could sense it. What could have derailed everything ended up deepening the story. I've often thought about that when I've faced my own setbacks. We tend to treat injuries, whether physical, emotional, or creative, as interruptions. But maybe they're also invitations to reimagine how the story unfolds. Then there are the quiet, surprising stories, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Like the fact that the youngest member of the cast, who played a supporting role, would often fall asleep on set between takes. Instead of waking him roughly, the crew began tiptoeing around, whispering, even adjusting lights so the boy could rest a little longer. Those small acts of kindness are rarely mentioned in glossy press releases, but to me, they reveal the heart of the production, or the way food became a central ritual. The caterer, a local chef hired almost last minute, introduced the cast and crew to dishes many of them had never tasted before, comfort foods from his childhood. Soon, the entire crew was requesting his meals by name, joking that they were training as much for the kitchen as for the fights. There's something beautiful about that. The way a set becomes a village, complete with shared meals and inside jokes. Weather, as always, played its games. One of the most pivotal outdoor scenes was scheduled for a clear evening. Instead, a sudden storm rolled in. Equipment had to be covered, actors sheltered, everything paused. But when the skies cleared, something magical happened. The soaked ground reflected the neon lights of the city in shimmering puddles, creating an unplanned but stunning visual effect. The director, seizing the moment, rolled cameras immediately. That footage ended up being one of the most iconic shots of the entire film. A reminder, again, that chaos sometimes gifts you what planning cannot. Behind the cameras, there were moments of tension too. A director of photography and the director disagreed fiercely about how to shoot a climactic fight. One argued for sweeping crane shots, the other for tight handheld close-ups. For days, they butted heads. Finally, in a stroke of compromise, they decided to shoot both. In editing, the two approaches were woven together, wide arcs punctuated by intimate, shaky breaths. The result was a sequence that felt both epic and raw, a fusion of visions born out of conflict. That lesson lingers with me. Disagreement doesn't have to fracture a team. It can expand the possibilities. There's also a story about the sound designer that I adore. Dissatisfied with stock audio for punches and kicks, he went wandering through markets and streets, recording unexpected sounds. Cabbages being smashed, ropes snapping, even the thud of his own body against padded mats. Layered together, these odd recordings created fight sounds that felt richer, stranger, more visceral than anything you'd find in a library. Next time you watch, remember, that bone-crunching hit might just be a watermelon meeting a hammer. These behind-the-scenes anecdotes remind me that filmmaking is, at its core, play. Yes, it's grueling, stressful, filled with money and deadlines. But it's also adults pretending, experimenting, finding joy in the ridiculous. And that spirit seeps into the final product. Another charming detail. Between takes, one actor developed a habit of breaking the tension by doing silly impressions of the director, of the producer, even of his co-stars. At first, people rolled their eyes. But soon, these little performances became a cherished ritual, lightening moods during the heaviest days. A serious film was being made, yes, but laughter echoed between every cut. As production neared its end, the crew faced one last challenge: exhaustion. Months of relentless work had taken their toll. Morale dipped. And then, unexpectedly, a gesture revived them. One of the producers arranged a surprise screening of early footage, set up in a makeshift theater with popcorn and soda. For the first time, the cast and crew saw their efforts stitched together. They laughed, they cried, they cheered. They remembered why they were doing this. That night became a turning point, the fuel that carried them through the final, grueling days. Looking back on all of this, what strikes me most is not just the resilience of the team, but the tenderness. People carried each other. They bent when they had to, laughed when they could, and turned obstacles into opportunities. That's the kind of story that moves me, because it feels so human. When we sit in a theater, it's easy to forget that what we're seeing is the result of hundreds of lives interwoven: designers, grips, editors, cooks, assistants. But knowing these behind-the-scenes stories changes the way I watch. I notice the imperfections and remember the panic over permits. I hear a punch and imagine a cabbage splitting open. I see rain-soaked streets and recall a crew huddled under tarps, waiting for lightning to pass. And maybe that's why I find these insights so precious. They remind me that movies are not miracles. They're labors of love, messy, fragile, imperfect. And yet, somehow, they come together to create something that feels bigger than all of us. By the end of production, the cast and crew had become a family. Not in the superficial way people sometimes say after projects, but in the genuine way forged through hardship and laughter. They celebrated their rap not with glamour, but with karaoke, cheap beer, and heartfelt toasts. And in some ways, that celebration, the joy of having endured together, was the real ending, the real triumph. Every time I finish watching a movie of this scale, I find myself sitting in silence for a while, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well, in my body, in my memories, in the private corners of my mind where themes resonate like echoes. That was my experience here, and it left me reflecting for days afterward. There's something about the way the story leans into its themes that makes you feel less like you've consumed a piece of entertainment, and more like you've been given a parable to wrestle with. What struck me first, even before the symbols began to unravel, was the underlying heartbeat of the film: resilience. That word might sound obvious, a staple of martial arts stories, perhaps even a cliché, but here it doesn't feel packaged or shallow. It feels earned. Watching the characters wrestle with defeat, self-doubt, and cultural dislocation reminded me of my own childhood moments when I felt out of place, when my identity was both a shield and a burden. That, I think, is why this theme dug under my skin so quickly. It wasn't just about standing back up after being knocked down. It was about redefining what it meant to stand in the first place. Resilience shows up most vividly in the training sequences. They are more than montages, they're rituals. Every bruise, every repeated motion, every mistake carries symbolic weight. I remember one shot where the student is asked to sweep a courtyard, again and again, in endless circles. It reminded me of Sisyphus pushing his boulder uphill, except here the futility becomes transformation. The sweeping isn't just sweeping. It's about discipline, about learning the rhythm of the body, about respect for space and tradition. Watching that, I couldn't help but think of my own small daily routines. The chores I once thought meaningless, the tasks I once resented, and how, over time, they shaped my patience, my persistence. The symbolism of work as training is so deeply human, and so easily overlooked. Another theme that pulsates through the narrative is legacy. In every quiet conversation between mentor and student, there's the weight of what came before, the echo of past generations, their triumphs, their mistakes. This isn't a story about a single boy learning karate, or a single man teaching him. It's about threads connecting across time, about how the past whispers into the present whether we choose to hear it or not. Legacy here isn't romanticized. It's complicated. It's heavy. And yet, it's also the very thing that gives these characters the strength to keep moving. One of the most powerful symbols of legacy in the film is the dojo itself. On the surface, it's just a space, mats, weapons on the wall, a few tattered scrolls. But if you pay attention, the dojo evolves as the story does. Early in the film, it feels cold, almost unwelcoming. Shadows linger in the corners. The camera lingers on cracks in the wood, on faded banners. But as training continues, as trust deepens, the dojo begins to breathe differently. Light falls differently on the floor. The banners no longer look tattered but proud, weathered like the skin of a wise elder. The space becomes a character, a vessel for history and hope. I remember sitting in my own childhood classroom, the walls lined with peeling paint and flickering lights, and feeling it transform over time. Not because the building changed, but because I grew within it. That's what the dojo symbolizes. Not perfection, but continuity, the way a flawed place can become sacred through use and memory. Identity is another theme that presses its fingers gently, but firmly on your chest as you watch. The student's struggle is not only about mastering techniques, it's about asking, who am I? Am I defined by where I come from, by how others see me, or by the choices I make now? This theme unfolds quietly, often symbolized through mirrors and reflections. There are several moments where characters catch their own faces in glass, in water, in shadows, and the cinematography lingers there, inviting us to reflect alongside them. I found myself remembering moments when I've looked in mirrors and not recognized myself, when change had reshaped me in ways I wasn't ready to accept. The film taps into that universal dissonance, the strangeness of becoming. And then there's the theme of mentorship, which pulses at the heart of everything. The relationship between teacher and student is never simple here. It's not a one-way transmission of wisdom from elder to youth. It's reciprocal, messy, alive. The teacher learns just as much as the student, perhaps more. The symbolism of this dynamic often plays out through objects. A cup of tea poured unevenly, a belt tied too tightly, a broom passed from hand to hand. Each small act becomes a metaphor for trust, humility, and the slow, almost invisible transfer of knowledge. I thought of my own teachers, the ones who didn't just give me answers, but invited me into their worlds, who taught me not with lectures, but with gestures, silences, and patience. The film honors that kind of teaching, the kind that reshapes not just what you know, but who you are. Another layer that surprised me was the theme of reconciliation. Not just reconciliation between people, though that certainly exists, but reconciliation within oneself. The student, like so many of us, carries conflicting pieces: anger and tenderness, pride and shame, strength and fragility. The film doesn't ask him to choose one over the other. It asks him to integrate them, to make peace with contradictions. And isn't that the essence of growing up? Isn't that what we're all trying to do? To stop dividing ourselves into good and bad parts, and instead accept the whole of who we are? The symbolism here often takes the shape of dualities. Light and shadow in the same frame, two characters moving in mirror-opposite stances, the rhythm of blows followed by stillness. Every choice whispers of balance, of unity. One of the most subtle but beautiful symbols appears in the recurring presence of water. At first, water is simply background, rain on the street, a river beside the training grounds. But gradually, it becomes more than that. Water is fluid, adaptable, relentless. It yields, yet it carves stone. In one training scene, the student is told to strike water, to kick and punch at it. He grows frustrated. How can you fight something that slips away? But that's the point. The lesson is not to conquer water, but to learn from it. By the end of the film, when water appears again, it's no longer an enemy. It's a companion, a symbol of the student's own transformation. That image still sits in my mind. The way we fight life until we realize we must flow with it. Symbols appear too in silence. There are moments where no words are spoken, no punches thrown, no lessons explained. Just silence. A bird on a wire. A long pause before a bow. These silences are not empty. They are loaded with meaning. They remind me of the pauses in poetry, the spaces between words that carry as much weight as the words themselves. In life too, I've